Welcome to Collegial Conversations with Diana Clark, the professional webinar series that offers clinical and personal perspectives on issues that are common, but often not talked about. Here is today's Collegial Conversation.
Thank you for joining us for a Collegial Conversation with Diana Clark. Joining Diana today is Paul Hamblin, the CEO of the Bridge to Recovery, located in Bowling Green, Kentucky. Paul has been working in the field of addictions for over 20 years and has experience in admissions, intake, professional development, aftercare planning, case management, and marketing strategies. Paul's passion is helping individuals and families who are struggling to get the help that they need. Paul is joining us today to discuss family of origin trauma and codependency. Thank you for joining us today, Paul. I will now pass the conversation over to Diana.
Thank you, Laura, and welcome, Paul. In addition to that sleeve-length bio, I wanted to also say that Paul is an old colleague and friend of mine. We have worked together. I have known of his work for many decades at this point, and am really honored to have him having this conversation with me today. So welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yay. So let's talk about that term. I want to start right in. We're talking about family of origin trauma, but in more than anything else, we're talking about that word codependence. Does that word still work? And what is your definition of it?
Yes, and that's a great question, Diana, because I think some people think codependency is sort of a 70s term. And we at the Bridge, the definition is the pain that we experience in adulthood, which is a result of being wounded as a child. So, to us, codependency is still a trauma response. And that's, it's interesting, trauma to me is kind of like what dual diagnosis was 25 years ago. It's a hot topic, and as it should. And so, when we talk about codependency, because I think there's a negative connotation to the word codependency.
Totally.
You're weak or you're and it's more, it's attacking your character than it is, what we feel it is, which is it is a trauma response. And it's a trauma response from what happened to you as a child. I can't figure out a better word to describe.
I know, I've been trying it too. I've been doing workshops with family systems now for a couple of decades. And every time I get to the segment on codependence, I see people, sort of tilt their head and not in the concept is difficult to grasp.
Yeah.
So I love the way you are describing, and I'm going to paraphrase what you just said, which is codependence is a series of symptoms that are responsive to childhood trauma.
Yep.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I think that, people who consider themselves codependents are not weak in any way, shape, or form. It's not a character issue. It's not. It shouldn't be the negative. It shouldn't have the negative connotation that it has, because late stage codependency to us is as dangerous as late stage drug addiction, because especially if you are the parent of a chemically dependent person, and that's the challenge. The challenge is talking to those people about the fact that they may be killing their child, because every time they get into trouble, they fall into a bed of pillows, because that's the only response that their parents really know what to do about. So they're going to step in at times, and then even more importantly, they're not going to hold boundaries. To me, that's the biggest challenge with codependency, is somebody that's a parent that says, all right, we're going to help you, but we're only going to help you fight this disease. And then the next time that kid calls up and says, I need $100 for rent or for whatever, they cave, because they're scared to death of a couple of things. They're scared to death of how's that is my child going to like me anymore if I don't keep enabling him or her to carry on their addiction, but also the fact that they're responsible for that kid's behavior. And, they're not. We all know that. And you can say it to them a million times, but it's sort of breaking that cycle that's important.
Right. When I do workshops, I've stopped even using the word enabling, Paul, because I use the word protecting.
Yep.
What happens is that parents are trying to protect one thing, maybe their relationships, maybe the future, maybe the image of their loved one in the community, maybe their own addictions, but they're trying to protect something. But the way they're doing it is protecting sickness.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Very well phrased.
And I think that it's really, really hard to hold up that mirror. I admire the work that you guys do, because it's really hard to hold up to that mirror to a parent, to a spouse, to a child who really believes this is the only way I can make sure that my loved one, A, survives,
right,
and stays connected, and hold up that mirror to them and say, yeah, I know what you think you're doing is loving, and it's actually harming them.
Right. And the interesting thing to me is we get a lot of phone calls from therapists who want to refer their codependent client to us. And when I'm talking to them, they say, well, here's the thing. What I really need to have happen is for you to fix my son, fix my daughter, fix my husband, fix my wife. I'm not the sick one. And our answer to that is, you may not be the sick one, but you're the one in pain.
Right.
And to us, that's if you're in pain, it can manifest itself in 100 different ways. Drugs, alcohol, food, sex, work, gaming, gambling, codependency, love, enmeshment. I could go on for another half an hour.
Right.
And what we kind of look at is, we look at all of those things as sort of different branches of the same tree. And we're less interested in the branches of that tree as we are the trunk and the roots of that tree. And the trunk and the roots of the tree for us is family of origin trauma for the most part.
So can you speak a little bit, about what kinds of trauma you see at where you are? Because I'm sure it's as different as different people, but there must be themes.
Yeah. And the other thing that I always laugh at is when I get a phone call from somebody and says, I don't have any trauma. And I'm like,
You're breathing.
Did you have parents?
Right.
It's not like your parents were rubbing their hands together saying, how are we going to screw this child up? But a lot of this trauma is intergenerational trauma. So they were parented by parents that, didn't have the handbook either. So, and so I think, getting to, and to me, sort of the family of origin piece is also rooted in the 70s. And sometimes I think people stick to that as well. But to me, we're all sort of children walking around in adult bodies. And if you can kind of uncover and discover why you're doing the things that you're doing, and why you're making the decisions that you're making, and why you're in the relationships that you're picking, a lot of times it comes down to what happened to you as a child.
I know.
The assumptions that you make as a child that will stick with you for the rest of your life if you don't sort of uncover them. And then uncovering and discovering what those are great, but then you have to have tools in your toolbox that when you start feeling those feelings again, that you don't go down that rabbit hole again. So we look at a lot of things that are surrounding that, people pleasing, image management, control, enmeshment. Because all I think are developed at a young age. And if you can sort of go back to those places where those wounds happen, and our hashtag at the Bridge to Recovery is, it's not my shame.
Yeah.
Because I think we carry a lot of that.
Yeah.
We carry a lot of that with us. I'm not only the CEO of the Bridge, but I'm a former client. So I sort of feel like the hair club president for men. And I remember being in group the first day, and we're all introducing ourselves, and I heard these terrible stories of physical abuse and sexual abuse. And they got to me, and I kind of meekly raised my hand and said, well, my parents ignored me. And I remember thinking at the time, God, that doesn't stack up, isn't remotely as, as awful as what I just heard. But I realized over time that my pain is my pain. And sometimes for those folks, it's even more difficult because you're being abused if somebody's beating you up. But if you are just sort of ignored, and my parents didn't do it out of malice, and they didn't do it out of any of those things, but the message that I got at a young age was that I'm not good enough. There must be something wrong with me. And so how you react going forward, if you never get to that insight that, it really wasn't your shame and it's not your fault and all those things, then the people that you choose in your life, the decisions that you make in your life are all going to be colored by that. So getting to those roots and sort of getting to your core issues. And I think there aren't very many programs out there that deal with this kind of, if somebody's struggling, the options typically are, we'll send them to a primary drug and alcohol program or send them to a psych facility. But where's that middle ground for that person that just is sober and miserable because, they may have put the plug in the jug, but they're still, they're still in pain. And if you can get some answers and then get some tools in your toolbox to take with you when you start feeling those feelings again, then you're in a much better place.
So I know I was fortunate to have one of those insurance plans back in the 80s when I could go to unlimited sessions and get insurance reimbursement, and did a lot of that family of origin work and did it over a much longer period of time. But I feel like it was such a privilege to be able to do that work. And that is not what is being offered people on a regular therapeutic basis these days. And what your program is doing is culling all of those years into this sort of rubric of how you heal from that kind of stuff. Now that those programs aren't available anymore, that's coverage. Yeah.
And you're right. And it's interesting, we don't, and again, insurance doesn't cover it. So we don't take insurance, and we're a workshop. We're not considered treatment. But it's interesting to watch the makeup of the groups, because you may have a group where you have a codependent parent of a heroin addict. You may have a heroin addict who is sober now, but every time they get sober, they get into another toxic relationship based on their family of origin. You may get a workaholic. You may get a sex addict. And you're thinking about, and people ask me all the time, well, how come you're not just focusing on my issue? And the issue is that we're all in pain.
Right. These are faulty coping strategies.
All maladaptive coping mechanisms. And so, and it's interesting, it happens more often than I think is coincidence, and maybe it's divine intervention, but that codependent mom of the heroin addict and the heroin addict get to see the humanity in each other, and they get to see the pain that's being transferred back and forth in a way that you would never see with your own child or your own parent. So it's just, I love the kind of work that we're doing, because I think everyone in the world could do some of this work, because we've all experienced something that we haven't resolved typically.
Right. I was struck by your sense of trauma from being ignored. And I went to immediately the trauma of being invisible.
Yes.
Not ignored, but being invisible. I don't count. And therefore, that expression that I hear associated with codependence, how empty of me to be so full of you, seems to make sense. If you are invisible or you are traumatized as a youth, you don't want to be full with yourself.
No,
You know, it's possible. So I'll be full with somebody else.
and other people are my mirrors. If they're happy with me, then I'm happy with me.
And I'm okay.
I'm invisible, and you like me, and I'm not quite sure I like myself. So that's what's important to me. And but then it spins off to image management. That's a huge thing for people. People want to look good in the eyes of everyone else, and you may be in terrible pain but if everything else on the outside looks really good. And we see a lot with families who never talked about anything. Never talked about. We've had people whose sisters and brothers have died, and the family never discussed it because it's not anybody else's business. We're not. If we don't talk about it, then we don't have to worry about any of those things. And how that affects you as you grow up is
shame,
devastating.
Shameful pockets.
Yeah. Yep. And shame reduction is a huge part of what we do.
And stigma reduction, I would imagine too.
Yes.
Making things understandable as in context of this is a response to pain.
Yep.
These are maladaptive coping strategies.
Yep.
And we're all seeking the same thing. What we're seeking isn't bad. Yes.
No. And honestly, it's very hard to do this work once a week in a therapist's office.
Yeah.
Because life is happening to you the whole time. Those 23 hours that you're not in the therapist's office that day and the rest of the week. And so, our program is an intensive 2-week program, but you can stay longer if you'd like. But that's all you're doing. You're just working on yourself. It's a great gift to give yourself, I think.
It is. It sounds like a great gift. It really does. I would have been a very different person, but for the luxury of my resources. But what you're saying is doing it once a week, it took 10 years.
Right.
I mean, not many people have 10 years.
No, they don't. And and I also think it's interesting that there are a number of programs out there that say they do trauma work, and I'm sure that they do a good job. I just have a hard time understanding how you do trauma work with a rolling admission. And what I mean by that is when people come to us, everybody starts on the same day.
So you have a class that begins together.
Yes.
So
logistically, it can be kind of a nightmare, but because people are, if they're really wanting to start and they call the Tuesday after a Monday admission, you got to tell them I got to wait 13 days. But the difference is if you're asking people to look at some really uncomfortable things in your life and to really open up and watch other people get brave and talk about things and see that the sky didn't fall when they disclose something, and to have a feeling of safety. You don't want it to be a rolling admission where you've opened up and then tomorrow somebody new comes in or somebody leaves out of your group. So it's I told 8 strangers things I'd never told anyone in my life before because it was a safe container to do that. And so, people say to me all the time, well, gosh, you could probably have a lot more admissions if you just admitted every day. But it's clinically, it just doesn't make sense to us.
No, I hear what you're saying. Thank you for making that point. I know of very few sort of resources that do have that cohort that starts together and finishes together, or at least starts together and gets the basic vulnerability work done together without people coming and going.
Yes.
Yeah, I can imagine.
We're also open-ended.
Yeah.
We're open-ended because I think there's a lot of workshops that, you come on Friday and you leave on Saturday of that week. And regardless of where you are in the process, they're saying goodbye to you. And ours is open-ended, that you can stay in 2-week increments for 2.5 months if you want. But I think that's important too, because it's hard to open people up and then get them closed down to a safe place
Safely.
So I think that's important too, that I'm proud of the fact that we're open-ended, and I'm proud of the fact that we do 8 times a year, we do programs just for professionals.
Nice.
In the field.
Nice.
This field has a tendency to attract just a couple of wounded people.
Really? I'm surprised by that. Yeah.
So we kind of call them wounded healers, and it's a 1-week program, because we don't have to go into the didactic. We don't do a lot of the didactic stuff. We just jump right in with these folks, and it's amazing how many people in our industry, especially coming out of COVID, suffer from compassion fatigue. So that's part of it. It's part of why we got into the field in the first place, is because we like helping people. But when you're doing that all the time and you're still experiencing the trauma of COVID, which is, very real. So I'm really proud of the fact that we do that for mental health professionals.
Yay.
Yeah.
Yay.
Yeah.
And just for those listeners today, the name of the program is Bridge to Recovery, correct?
The Bridge to Recovery. Yep.
The Bridge. Okay. Got it. Well, if you were to talk to yourself 30 years ago, okay, 30 years ago, go back in the Wayback Machine, what would be the one piece of advice you would offer yourself?
Well, since I've been sober 27 years, it's a great question.
Yeah.
And what I would tell myself was that I'm enough, and that I'm not invisible. I am important. I don't have to edit what I say to impress you. And I think that's the real key. People say to me all the time, and what happened to me is, when I went through the bridge, it changed every relationship in my life.
Of course.
Because it changed my relationship with myself.
That
if you're okay, and if you're okay with yourself, and you understand that no is a complete sentence, so you can say no and not feel horrible about that, and feel good about it, then you have a real chance to become honest and vulnerable with other people. And to me, that's the key to happiness, is people are going to like you for who you are. And that was unfathomable to me.
Right.
Unfathomable. And, drugs and alcohol fit that bill just fine, because when I was using, those weren't issues that came up in my head. But getting sober didn't solve it either. I mean,
it began the process. That's right.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
That's why it's a challenge, I think. And I'm not saying this in every case, but it's interesting to get, we skew probably in the 30 to 50 range. Mm-hmm. The 20-year-olds still are kind of bulletproof and haven't been knocked down enough, and all those things.
And two-legged dope is still acceptable when you're 21.
Yes. Yep.
It stops being acceptable. It shouldn't be acceptable, but it is, it's culturally normal.
Yep.
At certain ages. It's when you want fulfilling connections that are authentic and feel like you are cared for by yourself and by other people for who you are. You got to be older.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and that's not to say that they can't get some insight. It's just that we don't see that as much.
No, I would think that's true. That makes sense. Especially as people are skewing later and making real committed relationships.
Right. And COVID has been, in some ways, kind of an eye opener for a lot of people. It's interesting, one of the things that we're seeing from some clients is not the empty nest syndrome, but the full nest syndrome, because these parents who had college age or young people that had all their family come back and live with them for
one of them. I was one of them. Absolutely.
Brings up all that old stuff, and brings up all the old stuff with the kids, but it brings up all the old stuff with parents. And I think as we're getting out of COVID, I think people are going to understand what a traumatic event COVID was. And it's like that study that showed two soldiers who witnessed the same horrors in war. Mm-hmm. And one gets horrible PTSD and the other one doesn't. And one of the precipitating factors is the person that has experienced childhood trauma gets PTSD more often than the person that didn't, because they're being re-traumatized, basically. And I think COVID is re-traumatizing a lot of people, especially with the isolation and the fear and all those things. So I think there's, desperate need for programs like ours now that people are feeling safe about at least getting back into doing a residential program or something like that.
I agree. Well, thank you, Paul Hamblin. It is a pleasure to talk with you as always.
Well, thank you. You're an old friend, and I really am honored to do this with you.
Thank you for joining this webinar. Tune in to more webinars and sign up for our newsletter at o'connorpg.com.